If you've ever given someone your whole heart and they used it against you, then this story is going to hit you harder than you expect. 48 hours before his second wedding, Harold Green overheard his fiancée on the phone in the bathroom of his own house. The door was cracked. The water was running. She always ran the water when she was on the phone, and Harold had thought it was a habit, a quirk, something charming. It wasn't charming. It was strategy. Because the voice coming through that door said, "Once the marriage is legal, I'll get him to add me to the deed. Give me 6 months, maybe 8, then we file." Harold could have walked in. He could have screamed. He could have called off the wedding that afternoon.
But instead, Harold Green, a 59-year-old retired postal worker from Macon, Georgia, who had buried his first wife 14 months earlier and had believed completely and without reservation that God had sent him a second chance, did something that no one, including his children, expected. He married her anyway. And what he did in the 6 months after the wedding would expose not just his new wife, but an entire system of people who'd been circling his family like vultures. And it would cost him everything he had left, except the one thing they couldn't take. Welcome. Please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Now tell us, where are you tuning in from? Dallas? Durban? Maybe Bridgetown or Toronto? We read every single comment. Now listen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to make your blood boil. And I mean boil. Because what this woman did to this man was not just cruel, it was calculated. It was patient. It was the kind of betrayal that dresses itself up in lipstick and Sunday perfume and sits next to you in church and holds your hand while it's planning to take your house. So let me start from the beginning, because you need to know who Harold was before she got to him. You need to understand what she destroyed. Harold Green was 59 years old, and he looked exactly the way you'd expect a man who had delivered mail in the same Georgia town for 34 years to look. Sturdy, sun-darkened across the forearms and the back of his neck, with thick hands that were permanently curved from gripping a mail satchel 5 days a week since 1985. He was 6 feet tall, but carried himself like he was 5'10", a slight forward lean that came from decades of walking with weight on one shoulder. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth that he never fixed, because his first wife, Ruth, had told him it was the first thing she noticed about him, and that fixing it would be like editing the sentence that made her fall in love. Harold kept the gap. He kept a lot of things Ruth loved. The blue flannel shirt she bought him at a church rummage sale in 1992. The coffee mug with the chipped handle that said, "World's okayest husband," that she'd given him as a joke on their 20th anniversary. The garden behind the house where Ruth grew tomatoes and peppers, and a stubborn rosemary bush that refused to die no matter how many winters it survived. The house. Now the house is important, so pay attention. Harold and Ruth had bought the house on Vineville Avenue in 1991 for $62,000, a 3-bedroom brick ranch with a carport, a screened porch, and a yard big enough for the garden and a swing set that their children, Denise and Calvin, had used until they were too old and too tall, and the chains left rust on their clothes. The mortgage was paid off in 2014. Harold owned it outright. It was worth, by 2019 estimates, approximately $185,000. Not a fortune, but a lifetime of payments completed, a roof that was his, a place where he had raised 2 children and loved 1 woman, and built a life that was small by some measurements, and enormous by the only ones that mattered. Ruth died on September 3, 2018. Pancreatic cancer. She was 56. The diagnosis came in March. She was gone by September. 6 months. That's all the time the universe gave Harold to prepare for the largest absence of his life. He used those months the way Ruth asked him to. Not in hospitals when it could be avoided, not in waiting rooms, not in the fluorescent purgatory of oncology departments, but at home. In the garden, on the screened porch, in the kitchen where Ruth made peach cobbler from a recipe her grandmother had written on the back of a church bulletin in 1971, and that Ruth had memorized so completely she could make it with her eyes closed, and sometimes did, just to prove she could, just to make Harold laugh. Ruth was buried at Rose Hill Cemetery on a Tuesday. The weather was warm. The rosemary bush was still alive. Harold came home from the funeral and sat on the screened porch and drank coffee from the chipped mug, and didn't cry because he had cried so much in the preceding months that the mechanism had simply worn out, like a faucet that's been turned too many times. He sat there until dark. Denise, 31, a nurse at Navicent Health in Macon, came and sat with him.
Calvin, 28, an electrician who lived in Warner Robins, 30 minutes south, came and sat on the other side. Nobody spoke. The three of them sat on Ruth's porch and listened to the crickets, and the absence and the specific, awful silence of a house that still smells like the person who isn't in it anymore. Harold grieved the way quiet men grieve, privately, steadily, without drama. He kept his routine. He woke at 5:30. He made coffee, 2 cups, one for himself, one for Ruth, which he poured into her mug and set on the kitchen table across from his. He drank his. He left hers until it went cold. Then he poured it out and washed the mug and put it back on the shelf. He did this every morning for 14 months. It was not rational. It was not healthy. It was the last conversation he had with his wife. A cup of coffee, made the way she liked it, set in her place, grown cold, poured away. A daily rehearsal of loss. Can you believe that? A man making coffee for a woman who's been gone for over a year. That tells you everything about Harold Green. He was loyal. He was habitual. He was constant. And those were the exact qualities that made him a target. But what happened next changed everything. Vanessa Moore arrived in Macon in January 2019, approximately 4 months after Ruth's death. She was 43 years old, 16 years younger than Harold, with straightened hair, careful makeup, and the kind of smile that felt like sunlight when it was pointed at you, and like nothing at all when it wasn't. She joined Greater Hope Baptist Church on her first Sunday in town. She sat in the 3rd pew. She introduced herself to the pastor, Reverend James Whitfield, and told him she had recently divorced and moved from Atlanta to start fresh. She was warm. She was attentive. She volunteered for the women's ministry within 2 weeks. She brought a sweet potato pie to the church potluck that was so good 3 women asked for the recipe, and she said, "It's a family secret," with a laugh that made everyone lean in. She noticed Harold immediately. Of course she did. A widower in a small church is not invisible. He is the opposite of invisible. He is the most visible man in the room, because grief sits on a person like a second shadow, and everyone can see it. Harold sat alone in the pew where he and Ruth had sat together for 23 years. The space beside him was empty. Vanessa saw the space. She didn't sit in it immediately. She was too smart for that. She waited 3 Sundays. Then she sat beside him and said, "I hope you don't mind. The other pews are full." They weren't full. Harold knew they weren't full. But he was lonely in a way that had turned his judgment to water. And her voice was warm, and the pew had been empty for 4 months. And he said, "Of course. Please." Now, here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Vanessa courted Harold with the precision of a woman who had done this before. Not carelessly, precisely. She asked about Ruth. She asked about the garden. She asked about the children. She didn't push. She didn't rush. She brought food, not every week, just often enough that Harold began to expect it without noticing he expected it. Baked chicken on Wednesdays, collard greens on Sundays, a peach cobbler, not Ruth's recipe, a different one that was good but not the same. And the not the same was important because Vanessa was smart enough to know that competing with a dead woman's cobbler would be a fatal mistake. She made her own cobbler. She let Harold miss Ruth's. She filled a different space, not the same one. And that is the move that separates a predator from an amateur. By June 2019, they were dating. By August, Harold had introduced her to Denise and Calvin.
Denise was polite but cautious. She had Ruth's instincts, the ability to feel the temperature of a room before the thermometer confirmed it. She told Harold, "Daddy, it's soon." Harold said, "I know, baby, but she makes me feel less alone." Denise heard the loneliness in his voice, and she didn't push, because what do you say to a man who is drowning and someone has thrown him a rope? You don't say the rope might be attached to something. not when he's still underwater. Calvin was less cautious. Calvin liked Vanessa. She laughed at his jokes. She asked about his work. She brought him a bottle of hot sauce she said she'd found at a specialty store in Atlanta. And it was good hot sauce. And Calvin was a man who could be won with hot sauce and attention. And Vanessa knew that because Vanessa studied people the way a locksmith studies locks. Not to appreciate the mechanism, but to open it. But Harold had no idea what was coming. In October 2019, Vanessa suggested they move in together.
Harold said he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't pressure. She simply said, "I understand, Harold. Whenever you're ready." And then she waited. She waited the way a specific kind of person waits. Not patiently, but strategically. The way a chess player waits for the board to arrange itself. In January 2020, Harold proposed. He did it on the screened porch, in the evening, with the garden behind them and the rosemary bush still alive, and the chipped mug on the table because he hadn't been able to stop making Ruth's coffee, even though he was proposing to another woman. He got down on one knee, his left knee, the one that ached from 34 years of walking routes, and he held out a ring that had belonged to his mother. Not Ruth's ring, his mother's. He gave Vanessa a different ring, because even in his loneliness, even in his need, something in Harold knew that Ruth's ring was Ruth's ring, and it would stay in the small velvet box in the top drawer of the dresser until he died. Vanessa said yes. She cried. The tears looked real. Maybe some of them were. That's the thing about people like Vanessa. They are not entirely hollow. They feel things. They just feel their own desires more than they feel anyone else's pain. And the imbalance is so total that it creates a kind of moral gravity that bends everything around them toward their own needs. The wedding was set for March 14th, 2020. And on March 12th, 48 hours before the ceremony, Harold came home early from the hardware store because he'd forgotten his wallet. And he heard the water running in the bathroom and a voice through the cracked door that reorganized his entire understanding of the woman he was about to marry. Once the marriage is legal, I'll get him to add me to the deed. Give me 6 months, maybe 8. Then we file. Harold stood in the hallway. His wallet was in his back pocket. He hadn't forgotten it after all. His body must have known what his mind didn't. His feet had brought him home for a reason. He stood there and he listened. The voice on the other end of the phone. He couldn't hear the words, just the rhythm. A man's voice, confident, familiar with the plan, was someone Vanessa knew well. This was not the first conversation of its kind. This was a progress report. Vanessa said, "The house is worth at least 180, maybe 190. He has a pension, 34 years federal, and there's a life insurance policy. I haven't found the number yet, but it's there." Harold's hand went flat against the hallway wall, not to steady himself, to keep himself from opening that door. Because Harold Green, in that moment, made a decision that would define the next 6 months of his life. He decided not to confront her. He decided to let her marry him. He decided to watch. If you think that was bad, wait until you hear what Harold did next. He married Vanessa Moore on March 14th, 2020, in the chapel at Greater Hope Baptist Church, with Reverend Whitfield officiating, Denise standing as a reluctant witness, and Calvin smiling in the front row because Calvin still didn't know. Harold said his vows. Vanessa said hers. He kissed her. The congregation clapped. And Harold went home with his new wife and began the most disciplined, most painful, most heartbreaking performance of his life. He pretended to trust her. He let her move in. He let her rearrange the kitchen. She put the chipped mug in the back of the cabinet, behind the glasses no one used, and Harold noted where she put it and said nothing.
She took down the photograph of Ruth that hung in the hallway. "It's hard to walk past every day," she said, and Harold said, "I understand," and put the photograph in the closet, face down, where Vanessa wouldn't think about it. She suggested they repaint the bedroom. Harold said yes. She chose gray. Ruth's color had been yellow. The color of the kitchen in the morning, the color of the garden in August, the color of a woman who believed that walls should feel like sunlight. Vanessa painted over the sunlight with gray. Harold watched her do it. He helped her do it. He held the roller and covered the walls his wife had chosen,
And he didn't say a word because the performance required silence, and Harold was performing the role of his life. But the real shock was still coming. Harold began collecting evidence. He did it the way he had done everything in his life, methodically, quietly, without drama. He noted dates, he noted phone calls, the times, the durations, the fact that Vanessa always ran the water when she talked. He noted the documents she looked for, the deed to the house, which she asked about casually. Have you ever thought about putting my name on it, just for safety? The life insurance policy. Do you have a beneficiary listed? You should update it, sweetheart. The pension paperwork. What happens to your pension if something happens to you? Every question was delivered with warmth. Every question was a blade. He went to see a lawyer. Not the family lawyer, a different one. A woman named Patricia Odom, who practiced family law in an office on Cherry Street and who, when Harold explained the situation, put down her pen and said, "Mr. Green, you're telling me you married this woman after you heard the phone call?" Harold said, "Yes, ma'am." Patricia said, "Why?" Harold said, "Because she came into my church and she sat next to me and she brought me food and she made me believe that God had answered a prayer I never said out loud. She used my faith. She used my loneliness. She used the fact that I missed my wife so much I couldn't see straight. And I want to know who else she's done this to. Because a woman who's this good at it didn't learn it on me." Patricia looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Green, let's find out." And that single moment set off a chain of events nobody could stop. Patricia hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Ray Marsh, who had spent 22 years working fraud cases in Atlanta. Ray started digging. What he found made Patricia put her pen down a second time. Vanessa Moore was not Vanessa Moore. Her legal name was Vanessa Price. She had been married 3 times before Harold. Each marriage had followed the same pattern: join a church, identify a widower or recently divorced man with property, court him with food and faith and patience, marry him, get added to the deed or named as beneficiary, and then initiate a divorce that, under Georgia law, entitled her to a share of marital assets, including any property to which she had been added during the marriage. Her first husband, a retired teacher in Columbus, had lost his house. Her second husband, a mechanic in Augusta, had lost his savings. Her third husband, a farmer in Statesboro, had lost 40 acres of land that had been in his family for 3 generations. Each time, Vanessa, or whatever name she was using, had moved to a new town, joined a new church, and started again. The man on the phone was her brother, Terrence Price. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a financial advisor. He was a real estate agent who handled the sales of the properties Vanessa extracted from her marriages. They were a team. They had been running this operation for 12 years. Ray found all 3 ex-husbands. He interviewed them. Each man told the same story: the church, the food, the patience, the warmth, the slow extraction of assets, the divorce that came out of nowhere after 6 to 12 months. The retired teacher, a man named George Hollins, 71, said, "She made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. And then she made me feel like I had never been more alone in my life." The mechanic, a man named Douglas Fry, 63, said, "I didn't see it coming. I thought she loved me." The farmer, a man named Walter Sims, 68, said nothing. He just looked at the floor. Walter had moved in with his daughter after losing the farm. He hadn't spoken about Vanessa in 4 years. Now, what Harold was about to discover would change everything. Harold didn't confront Vanessa. Not yet. He waited. He continued the performance. He smiled at breakfast. He went to church with her. He let her suggest adding her name to the deed, and he said, "That's a good idea, sweetheart. Let me talk to the lawyer about it." He bought time. He gathered documents. He collected the phone records that showed 247 calls between Vanessa and Terrence in the 7 months since the wedding. He documented the documents she had accessed. She had gone through his filing cabinet in the spare room while he was at the hardware store, and Harold knew because he had placed a single hair across the drawer, a trick his father had taught him as a boy, and the hair was broken every time he checked. He told Denise. He sat her down at the kitchen table. Not the screened porch, because the porch was Ruth's place, and this conversation did not belong there. And he showed her the phone records, the marriage history, the interviews with the 3 ex-husbands. Denise read everything. Her face went through a sequence that Harold recognized because it was the same sequence Ruth's face went through when Ruth was angry. The tightening of the jaw, the narrowing of the eyes, the slow flush that started at the neck and rose. Denise said, "Daddy, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Harold said, "Because I needed to be sure, and because I needed you to see the whole picture, not just the part that makes you angry." Denise said, "I'm past angry, Daddy." Harold said, "Good. Then you're ready." He told Calvin next. Calvin's reaction was different. Calvin went silent. The hot sauce, the jokes, the easy trust, all of it collapsed inward. Calvin sat at the table and stared at the phone records, and his hands curled into fists, and he said, "She sat in my mother's pew." Harold said, "I know, son." Calvin said, "She put Mama's mug in the back of the cabinet." Harold said, "I know." Calvin's voice cracked. "I liked her, Daddy. I defended her to Denise. I told Denise she was being too hard on her." He looked at his father. "I'm sorry." Harold put his hand on Calvin's shoulder. "You don't apologize for trusting people, Calvin. You apologize for breaking trust, not for giving it. She owes the apology, not you." But the biggest secret hadn't come out yet. In September 2020, 6 months after the wedding, the exact timeline Vanessa had laid out on the phone, she made her move. She came to Harold on a Saturday morning and said, "Sweetheart, I think we should add my name to the house deed. It's our home now. I want to feel like it's ours." She said it while pouring his coffee. She said it while smiling. She said it the way she said everything, with warmth, with care, with the precise emotional calibration of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 4 times before. Harold set his coffee down. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at the kitchen she had rearranged, the walls she had painted gray, the cabinet where she had hidden Ruth's mug. He looked at this woman who had sat in his wife's pew and brought him chicken on Wednesdays, and cried at their wedding, and slept beside him for 6 months while planning to take his house. And Harold said, "Okay." Vanessa blinked. She hadn't expected it to be that easy. She had prepared arguments, rebuttals, emotional appeals. She had a whole script. Harold had rendered it unnecessary with one word. "I'll set up a meeting with the lawyer," Harold said. "How about Thursday?" Vanessa smiled. The real smile. Not the warm one she performed for Harold, but the satisfied one she saved for Terrence. "Thursday's perfect," she said. On Thursday, Harold and Vanessa drove to the lawyer's office on Cherry Street. Vanessa was wearing a yellow dress. Yellow, the color Ruth loved, and whether Vanessa chose it intentionally or by accident, Harold felt it either way. They walked into Patricia Odom's office. Patricia was sitting behind her desk. She was not alone. Ray Marsh was sitting in the corner. Denise was sitting by the window. Calvin was standing by the door. Vanessa saw them and stopped. Her smile, the warm one, the public one, flickered. "Harold, what is this?" Harold sat down. He didn't ask Vanessa to sit. He said, "Your name is Vanessa Price. You've been married 3 times before me. George Hollins in Columbus, you took his house. Douglas Fry in Augusta, you took his savings. Walter Sims in Statesboro, you took his farm. Your brother Terrence handles the real estate sales. You joined my church 4 months after my wife died because you saw a lonely man with a paid-off house and a federal pension, and you decided I was next." Vanessa's face didn't collapse. It hardened. The warmth evaporated like water on a hot surface, instant, total, leaving nothing behind except the dry surface underneath. She looked at Patricia. She looked at Ray. She looked at Denise, who was staring at her with Ruth's eyes. She looked at Calvin, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and something behind his eyes that was not anger, but the specific, devastating disappointment of a man who had trusted someone and been made a fool for it. Vanessa said, "You can't prove any of this." Patricia opened a folder. "Phone records. 247 calls to Terrence Price since March. Marriage certificates from Muskogee County, Richmond County, and Bullock County. Property transfer records from all 3 marriages. Signed affidavits from George Hollins and Douglas Fry. And a recorded conversation between you and Terrence Price from March 12, 2020, in which you explicitly discuss obtaining the deed to Harold's home and filing for divorce. Harold had recorded the conversation. On March 12th, standing in the hallway with his wallet in his back pocket, Harold had taken out his phone and pressed record. The hardware store trip hadn't been forgotten. It had been a cover. Harold's body had brought him home, and Harold's hand had known what to do. Vanessa looked at the phone on Patricia's desk. The recording was playing. Her own voice filled the room. "Once the marriage is legal, I'll get him to add me to the deed. Give me 6 months, maybe 8. Then we file." The room was quiet. The recording continued. Terrence's voice. "What about the pension?" Vanessa's voice. 34 years federal. That's worth more than the house." Terrence. "And the insurance?" Vanessa. "I'll find it. He keeps everything in a filing cabinet in the spare room." Patricia stopped the recording. She looked at Vanessa. "Mrs. Green, or Ms. Price, my client is filing for annulment on the grounds of fraud. Georgia recognizes annulment when one party entered the marriage with the intent to deceive. We have more than sufficient evidence. The annulment will restore Mr. Green's property and pension rights to their premarital status. No assets will transfer. Additionally, Mr. Green is filing a civil complaint for fraud, and we are referring the matter to the Bibb County District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." Vanessa stood up. She looked at Harold. For a moment, just a moment, something real passed behind her eyes. Not guilt, not shame, recognition. The recognition of a person who has been outmaneuvered by someone they underestimated. She said, "You played me." Harold shook his head. "No, you played yourself. I just let you finish the game." Vanessa looked at Calvin. She looked at the man she had won with hot sauce and attention and laughter. Calvin didn't look away. He said, "You sat in my mama's pew." That was all he said. It was enough. Vanessa walked out. She left the yellow dress behind when she moved out of the house the following week. Left it hanging in the closet, a ghost of a color that didn't belong to her. Harold put it in a bag and donated it to the church rummage sale. He didn't want it in the house. Ruth's color, in someone else's hands, in someone else's plans. He needed it gone. The annulment was granted in December 2020. The civil fraud case resulted in a judgment of $34,000 against Vanessa, restitution for legal costs and emotional damages. The criminal investigation led to charges against both Vanessa and Terrence for fraud and conspiracy. Terrence pleaded guilty and received 2 years probation. Vanessa went to trial. She was convicted in March 2022 and sentenced to 18 months in state prison. George Hollins, Douglas Fry, and Walter Sims all filed civil suits using the evidence Harold and Ray and Patricia had gathered. George recovered partial value of his home. Douglas recovered his savings. Walter didn't recover the farm. It had been sold and resold twice. But he recovered $47,000 in damages, and he told Harold on the phone, "You did what I couldn't do. You stayed awake." Now let me tell you what happened after, because the aftermath is where you see who a person really is. Harold went home. He repainted the bedroom. Yellow. Ruth's yellow. He opened the back of the cabinet and took out the chipped mug and put it back on the shelf where it belonged. Front row, next to his mug, handle facing right because that's how Ruth always said it. He went to the garden. The rosemary bush was still alive. Of course it was. Ruth had planted it, and Ruth's things didn't quit. He stopped making 2 cups of coffee. Not because he stopped missing Ruth, he would never stop missing Ruth, but because the ritual had served its purpose. It had kept her close during the months when closeness was the only medicine available. Now Harold had a different medicine. He had the knowledge that he had protected his wife's house, his wife's garden, his wife's rosemary bush, and his wife's children from a woman who had come to take them. That protection was its own kind of intimacy, a conversation with Ruth that didn't need a coffee cup. Denise came over every Sunday for dinner. She sat on the screened porch with Harold, and they ate whatever Harold had attempted to cook. He was not good in the kitchen, had never been, had relied on Ruth and then on Vanessa, and was now learning at 59 to feed himself, badly, with overcooked chicken and under-seasoned greens that Denise ate without complaint, because the food was terrible and the company was everything. One evening, Denise said, "Daddy, how did you know to record that phone call?" Harold thought about it. He said, "I didn't know. My hand just did it, like it already knew what my brain hadn't figured out yet." Denise said, "You think Mama was looking out for you?" Harold looked at the garden. The tomatoes were coming in, small and stubborn, the way Ruth's tomatoes always were, never photogenic but always sweet. He said, "I think your Mama planted things that keep growing. The tomatoes, the rosemary, you and Calvin. She planted things that last. And I think she planted something in me too. Some kind of alarm that goes off when somebody's trying to take what she built." He paused. "I didn't hear that alarm for a long time, but when it went off, I listened." Calvin moved back to Macon in 2021. Not into the house. He rented an apartment 4 blocks away because he was 29 and needed his own space, but 4 blocks was close enough. He came over on Saturday mornings and worked in the garden with Harold. They didn't talk much. They pulled weeds and staked tomatoes and pretended that the work was about vegetables, when it was really about proximity. About a son standing next to his father in a garden his mother planted, rebuilding something that a stranger had tried to poison. One Saturday, Calvin was kneeling in the dirt next to the rosemary bush, and he said without looking up, "I should have listened to Denise." Harold said, "You listened to your heart. That's not wrong." Calvin said, "My heart got played." Harold knelt beside him, his left knee aching, always aching. The knee that had carried 34 years of mail and 1 proposal and 6 months of acting and the weight of a house that someone tried to steal. He said, "Calvin, your heart trusted someone. That woman used your trust against you. But the trust itself, that came from your mother. She raised you to give people a chance. Don't you dare apologize for being the kind of man Ruth Green raised. You hear me?" Calvin looked at his father. His eyes were wet. He nodded once. Then he went back to weeding, and Harold knelt there beside him, in the garden, in the dirt, 2 men pulling weeds from the ground a woman they both loved had planted. And the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they would never need to say. Reverend Whitfield came by the house one evening. He sat on the screened porch with Harold and drank lemonade and looked out at the garden. He said, "Harold, I'm sorry. I should have seen it. She came into my church and I welcomed her and I never thought to question." Harold held up his hand. "Reverend, she fooled me, and I was sharing a bed with her. She fooled Calvin, and he's smart as they come. She fooled 3 other men before me. You're a pastor, not a detective. Your job is to open the door. You did your job." Reverend Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you learn from all this, Harold?" Harold sipped his lemonade. He looked at the rosemary bush. He said, "I learned that loneliness is the most dangerous thing a person can feel. Not because it's bad. Loneliness is just missing somebody. But it makes you blind. It makes you hear what you want to hear and see what you want to see, and ignore every alarm your body sets off. Because the alternative, staying alone in a house with a chipped mug and a cold cup of coffee, feels worse than any lie someone could tell you." He paused. "But I also learned that my wife raised children who showed up when it mattered. And she left me a garden that didn't quit. And she planted a rosemary bush that survived every winter I tried to neglect it. So I guess what I'm saying is, Ruth was still here. She was always still here. I just had to stop looking for her in other people and start looking for her in the things she left behind." Reverend Whitfield didn't say anything. He just nodded and drank his lemonade and looked at the rosemary bush, which was thick and green and showing no sign of dying. And both men understood that some things are planted so deep that no amount of frost or fraud or grief can pull them up. Today, Harold Green is 63 years old. He lives in the house on Vineville Avenue. The deed is in his name. The bedroom is yellow. The chipped mug is on the shelf. He still makes 1 cup of coffee in the morning, just one now, his own. But he drinks it at the kitchen table where Ruth used to sit, because he moved his chair to her side and found that the morning light hits differently from that angle, and he likes it better. He doesn't make 2 cups anymore. But he keeps her mug visible, front row, handle right, because some things don't need to be used to be present. They just need to be there. Denise is 35. She got married last year, a paramedic named James who Harold approves of. Not because James is perfect, but because James looks at Denise the way Harold looked at Ruth, and Harold knows what that look means, and what it costs, and what it's worth. Calvin is 32. He is dating a woman named Monique who he met at the hardware store, and he introduced her to Harold with the words, "Daddy, this is Monique."
Denise has already approved her.
Harold laughed, a real laugh, the kind that shows the gap in his teeth, and he shook Monique's hand and said, "Welcome to the family. We're a little banged up, but we're still standing." The rosemary bush is still alive. It survived another winter. It will survive the next one, and the next, because Ruth planted it, and Ruth's things don't quit. And so the story ends. But before you go, like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what this story taught you. We read every single comment. See you in the next story.